Welcome to Hotspot. Israel is at war with Hamas and all of Iran's proxies. What tactical steps can we expect from Israel in the near future to eliminate the threats they are facing? What are their strategies to counter the propaganda war? And what do they have to say about the civilian casualties that is mounting up and triggering international condemnation? And for how long does Israel afford to war? These and many other questions will be touched in today's program with my guest, Jonathan Conricus, former spokesperson for the IDF and senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome to take part of our conversation. Hello, welcome to Hotspot, Jonathan Conricus.
Shalom.
We are here, it's the 8th of May, and I would like you to comment on the current situation in the Middle East and for Israel. But actually, you are Sweden born, but you wanted
Sweden raised. Born
Sweden
in
raised?
Israel, but raised in
Okay,
Sweden.
raised in Sweden.
Correct.
Okay, short, can you just present your background since we are in Sweden?
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you for hosting me. So I was born in Jerusalem, but raised in Malmo. Malmo is in the news lately, I think for all the wrong reasons. And it is interesting to see that the Swedish government, for the second time, I believe, chose Malmo to host a high-interest event, the Eurovision Song Contest. And as an Israeli, and as a Jew, and as a Swede, and someone who grew up in Malmo, I am watching with a lot of concern for the future of what's left of the Jewish community in Malmo. But also what I see is rampant anti-Semitism and what looks like almost a loss of control of the public space for Swedish authorities in Malmo. And I wonder why Malmo was chosen for a second time to host the Eurovision contest. Usually, Eurovisions are held in capitals. And I think it would be better PR, and we will speak about PR mistakes of my country, and I'm sure that we'll address PR in various aspects. It's interesting that from a PR perspective, why did the Swedish government choose Malmo, knowing that it has the biggest Muslim population, knowing that it is a hotbed of anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish sentiment in Sweden. It's really a hotbed of a lot of bad things, sadly. I wonder if that was a wise choice.
Yeah, well, let's see if we can dig into it and see what the answer is.
Yeah.
When you came here in this morning, actually you were supposed to be at this public service. Or
I was.
Yes, you were asked, but they snubbed you.
Not the first time, and
not the
last time.
Yeah, what are you thinking? I mean, you are Swedish raised. You have been the former spokesperson twice for the IDF.
Yep.
And so you are a high profile, especially in the communication with media, and Israel and the Hamas conflict is on top of all the news today. What is your thought when they were not interested to have you on the radio or in TV so far?
Yeah, so last time I was on Swedish radio on P1, it was a few weeks ago. It was the sad, unfortunate event where 7 aid workers were killed by mistake by Israel in Gaza. Horrible event, good people who definitely should not have been killed, bad mistake by Israel. And when there are bad events that happen, then international media and Swedish media, they have a great interest in covering these events and reporting it to the world. So the Swedish public broadcaster, they reached out to me and I was happy to do an interview. It was a 9-minute interview. All of it was tough questions, no soft questions. And it was a tough topic, lots of criticism against Israel. And I was happy to be on and try to explain what Israel was doing and try to, display kind of a different perspective from what was being shown. And then the discussion that followed in on Twitter or X, and in social media, I could see on social media the tremendous amount of hatred that was focused on the Swedish broadcaster for even having me on. Not for asking me easy questions. There were no easy questions, and it wasn't a soft, nice interview. Please tell us how the security situation in Israel is affecting Israeli civilians, or tell us about Israeli refugees forced out of their homes, or tell us about the victims of the rape and the massacre of October the 7th. Those aren't the questions that I was asked. It was only about, blaming Israel for everything wrong virtually under the sun, and specifically with the tragic incident of killing the aid workers. And yet the pushback was tremendous. Why would you have this person on Swedish radio? He shouldn't be on radio. We don't want these people to have a voice. That was if I summarize the general sentiment. Maybe that has something to do with the decision not to have me on Swedish radio today. We made special coordinations. I cleared up my schedule because it's important to be on Swedish public radio. And I would have gone there and I would have spoken my broken Swedish. And I'm sure that we could have had a meaningful discussion. But editors decided differently. I don't know what the reason is, but I know that it's not the first time. And I don't think that it'll be the last time. But I will continue to avail myself, and I think it's important to, as a free and democratic society, to engage, hear a multitude of voices and opinions, not only the type of voices and the type of opinions that get 99.9% of the airtime in Swedish public broadcasting and a lot of Swedish media, which essentially is critical or hostile towards Israel, which sees and looks at everything in the conflict, first and foremost from a perspective of, well, Israel is to blame here, now let's explain why. And I think there's room for other voices to be heard as well.
Yeah, well, let's come back to this question later on in the program here. But the starting point of the conflict was the 7th of October. Many people asked themselves, and asked you, of course, how could you miss the build-up of Hamas stockpiling their weapons, planning and executing their plans without the IDF being there, being caught, unready? What is your answer?
I served in the IDF for 24 years. I was an infantry soldier, then a platoon commander, a company commander. I fought in Lebanon against Hezbollah. I fought in Gaza against Hamas. And then I served as an international relations. I served in liaison with the UN. And finally, I was a spokesperson. For 24 years, I was always tremendously proud to wear my uniform, my IDF uniform. I was proud to represent the IDF to other organizations and other militaries in the world. I was very proud always to wear my uniform and to be part of what I believe is the best fighting organization, of course, in Israel, but a really, really good army and an organization that works well and an organization that has a very solid moral compass and is absolutely crucial for the safety of Israel. I say that because after October the 7th, the first time that I ever felt not proud in my uniform was actually not vis-a-vis foreigners, but vis-a-vis Israelis. And I remember walking to a supermarket in Israel. I was preparing for my night shift in the spokesperson unit. I did the night shifts, and I bought a few things at a supermarket, and I remember people looking at me. I was in uniform, with lieutenant colonel's ranks, and the insignia was of the IDF spokesperson unit. And I remember people looking, and I could sense that it wasn't the usual look of people that respect and support the IDF. This was after October the 7th, and the looks had a different connotation of disappointment, of resentment, of anger, and many perhaps even worse feelings. So what I think eventually, what happened on October the 7th, there are many things that will have long-term effects in Israeli society. This is a Yom Kippur kind of moment. That's the magnitude, obviously. I think it's even bigger than that because on Yom Kippur, the IDF failed to defend itself and to defend its troops and came close to tactical and strategic defeat on the battlefield against the Egyptians and against the Syrians. But civilians, Israeli civilians, were not really affected. On October the 7th, we failed, the IDF, to such an extent that Israeli civilians were massacred in their homes. Women were raped, babies were killed, Israeli civilians were executed by Hamas stormtroopers, and Israeli civilians and soldiers were taken hostage. That is a failure that has never happened again. It never happened before. It is of totally different magnitude. The reasons, it's still difficult to say, you know, in a very succinct and, let's say, scientific, analytic way. But my opinion, after 7 months have passed and after there's been a lot of investigative journalism and after a lot of people have come forward and spoken about it, I think we can say a few things. One, and the underlying theme here, is a strategic misunderstanding and miscalculation both of Hamas's military capabilities and of their strategic long-term objectives. Israel willingly misinterpreted and really deceived itself in thinking that Hamas wasn't on the path to jihad and basically a continued fight against Israel, mukawama by all means, resistance by all means. But Israel convinced itself that Hamas was actually seeking stability and that Hamas wanted the good for the population, to have jobs, income, stability, and that Palestinians in Gaza would have it better. That was the general line of thought in Israel, and as such, Israel was allowing Palestinian workers from Gaza to come and work in Israel, more than 20,000 every day. And Israel was looking at what Hamas was doing and saying, well, all of these preparations, we see them preparing, we see them doing drills of invading into Israeli communities, we see them with their tunnels, we see them stockpiling weapons, and for some unexplainable reason, that was all marked off as, well, this is just for show, and the strategy is actually Hamas wants some kind of hudna, some kind of stability, not conflict, and that Hamas, and this is a key word, as Hamas is deterred by Israeli capabilities, that they know that Israel is much stronger. And in fact, that was proven totally wrong, totally erroneous.
Was there an intelligence blunder that you didn't get the intelligence, or was it...
Less so.
Was it the interpretation of the intelligence?
The interpretation of intelligence that was seen and monitored and then filtered up through the system. But then when it came to certain levels, the top of the military and the political echelon, but mostly the top of the military level, the mistake appears to have been the filter through which this intelligence was assessed. And the filter said, Hamas is deterred. Hamas doesn't seek conflict, and Hamas has been defeated by Israel in the past militarily, and that they're not trying to engage in battle against Israel. That, I think, is the perspective, the lens through which Israeli decision makers at the higher military level and at the political level were looking at things. That appears to have been the mistake. Second thing is a strategy of appeasement and a strategy of preferring quiet over mitigating enemy capabilities. And if we zoom out for a second, if we look around Israel's borders, there was Hamas, Islamic Jihad in Gaza, there still is Hezbollah in Lebanon, there are Iranian proxies in Syria. All of these are on Israeli borders. They are close to the Israeli borders in different areas. All of them are funded and equipped by Iran. But these organizations over years were able to establish themselves really along the border with Israel, within running distance of Israeli civilians and Israeli communities. Today, after October the 7th, we see what a horrible strategy that has been from an Israeli perspective, because what it has done is to allow terrorists under the guidance of Iran or independently to take the decision themselves when, where, and how strong they would like to attack. On October the 7th, that was exposed as well. So it's a failure on various levels. But one thing that we cannot shy away from as well, even if the intel failed, and it did, to analyze and assess the enemy's intentions and capabilities, and it shouldn't have failed, but it failed. What bothers me even more is that even though the intel failed on the ground, the IDF failed to respond in a relevant military manner, and the strategy of Hamas, or the plan of Hamas to go in, attack first the bases, and then go for the division headquarters and basically disable it for many years, that proved successful, and it allowed Hamas terrorists to almost or to walk at will and exercise total freedom of action in an area full of Israeli civilians. And then we saw the consequences.
But you're talking about the interpretation of the intel and the strategic decisions. I mean, as you are describing it, that's more of political visions. I mean, isn't the army's job to be ready for any kind of surprise and the political relationships to the surrounding is more on the political area?
It is the army's job to be prepared for all eventualities based on intelligence, but then also in addition to intelligence, the unknown unknowns, right? What your enemy may have the ability to do that you are not aware of that he has the ability to do. And that's exactly what I refer to, that even though the intel failed, the IDF should have been able to respond better. The IDF should have responded quicker. And I think that in hindsight, it's been said by the military leadership that we failed on both accounts in assessing the enemy's capabilities and intentions, but also in responding to what was happening on the ground. And that, I think, the trauma that you hear from Israeli civilians when they speak about the 7th of October, when you read the WhatsApp communications in family groups or the communal WhatsApp groups of kibbutzim that were overrun by terrorists, the text was, well, there are terrorists in the kibbutz, but don't worry, the IDF will be here soon. And unfortunately, in many cases, that wasn't reality, and the IDF didn't get there soon enough, and that is how Hamas was able to perform the atrocities that they did on October the 7th.
But you said that the IDF was not there and they will be there soon. Has there been an overconfidence in technology? I mean, you build these border fences with all these sensors. I don't know if I'm correctly informed, but you had something like called defensive victory in the 2020s, where you were trying to depend more on technology, AI, that you could pull down the number of troops that have to be at the borders. And now you saw these low-tech adversities come against you with these ragtag bands able to breach your borders. Is there also a kind of overconfidence in technology that could have been behind what happened?
Overconfidence or perhaps over-reliance. Israel is a very small country that has a unique and tremendous workload in terms of threats that it faces. No other country faces such a diversity of military threats from so many different areas, and no other country has to fight in as many theaters of operations and in as many dimensions as Israel. Israel has to defend itself along almost all of its fronts. We have peace with Egypt, but there's quite a lot of hostile activity from there as well. But other than that, all of the fronts are active combat fronts. So there's a tremendous need for troops and military capabilities. Budgets are limited and the availability of troops is limited. And hence, there's more and more reliance on technology. There's a general vector with all militaries around the world, but I care less about other militaries, and here it's about defending the Israeli homeland and Israeli civilians. There's a reliance on more and more technology, infrastructure and technology, which, yes, the IDF and the defense establishment thought that the border obstacle, the cameras, the sensors, and the troops that were deployed along the border would be enough. It's interesting to look at how Israel dealt with tunnels. Hamas used to dig tunnels from Gaza into Israel, and Israel found out, used technology in order to detect those tunnels successfully, and then built an underground wall, an obstacle. And then Hamas said, basically, okay, if Israel has blocked our path underground, then we will go back to the original one, which is above ground. And they found ways to attack the fence and to get across the obstacle, which Israel wasn't prepared for. The threat was more, in terms of the Israeli way of thinking, that Hamas would go underground and use the tunnels because we thought that they believed that they wouldn't be able to go above ground, and that the perimeter is an obstacle that they won't be able to breach. That was proven false, and it of course will force a lot of new thinking and reassessment of Israeli defenses, because Israeli defenses along the Lebanese border and on the Golan Heights, they rely on similar structures and similar strategies of border defense, of obstacles, cameras, etc. And we'll have to see how that will change. The bottom line here is that we, in the learning contest between Hamas and Israel, Hamas proved that they could leap over and that they could produce fighting capabilities that we didn't think that they had. They rehearsed, prepared, collected intelligence very successfully, and formulated a plan, and then executed the plan, and sadly it worked. And Israel will have to learn a lot from it, just as other terror organizations are watching this and planning accordingly. That's also why it's so important that October the 7th, whenever it ends, if it ends in a month, 2 months, or 5 years from now, that whenever it ends very clearly with an Israeli victory and a complete Hamas defeat. Because if the starting point of October the 7th can end with a Hamas victory or a tie, that means that this is a successful strategy for other terrorist organizations, and that is something that is tremendously dangerous for Israel in the immediate and also medium-term future.
Okay, so let's look at the current situation here. Top of the news right now in the war between Israel and Hamas is the civilian casualties. And the number that have been mentioned is 30,000 civilians have died.
Yeah.
What is your comment on that?
I was appalled when the US President Biden, in the State of the Union address, which is probably the most important address that a president gives during his tenure, one of the most important, when he referred to the civilian casualties in Gaza, saying that there were more than 30,000, most of them civilians, and that he didn't even say that these were Hamas figures. From my point of view, that's a strategic failure of Israel, that the President of the United States uses the numbers that have been advertised falsely by Hamas during war. Now, how did we come to this? Sadly, the number that we speak about is a result of a strategy that Hamas formulated early on, I think correctly, that they were going to leverage the amount of civilians killed as the main tool, and anything related to humanitarian suffering and challenges in Gaza, those would be the main weapons that they would use against Israel. And early on, I asked, recommended, demanded, and then asked again inside Israel that we start counting, that we start our count of dead terrorists that we have killed in combat and of what we assess to be dead or unfortunately civilians that have been killed as part of the fighting.
And are you counting?
Sadly, no. Sadly, no. And I think this is
you
a
cannot
strategic...
question the numbers coming out.
So you can question, and many
but you cannot
people
counter
do.
It with
Exactly.
facts.
And as long as the only number out there is the Palestinian number, sadly, that's what most people use. Even people who may be, let's say, analytically critical, maybe people who are not pro-Hamas or pro-Palestinians, but if it's the only number out there, then the likelihood is that it will be used, and sadly it is. Now, there have been various analyses of that number done by unaffiliated people who have just taken the numbers and crunched the numbers and assessed them, and they have poked 1 million holes into those numbers. A very disproportionate representation of women, children, elderly, and widows, and handicapped. That isn't proportionate to the general population. Glaringly missing are 17 to 35-year-old men from the total numbers. Very small percentage of the numbers represent men, even though the population in Gaza is half men and half women. But women have an outsized portion in the Palestinian reported numbers. And then there's many other factual errors Now there's pushback, and serious people have done assessments of the numbers. The Palestinian Health Authority, the Hamas-run health authority, has kind of walked back the numbers a bit and said, oh, it's actually not 34, it's 28, or maybe it's 30, and then done some revisions. The sad thing, I think, though, is that what has helped Hamas to get more legitimacy is that you've seen numbers from the Palestinian Health Ministry exported directly to different UN entities, humanitarian organizations, UNRWA and others. They just do copy-paste, and then they present it as if they have done the research and as if they have collected the amount of casualties. And then media organizations around the world say, well, the UN reported that, and then that's game over, because that lends it credibility if a UN organization, which isn't doing its job and isn't cross-checking and
what are they saying then, these third parties, when you are asking them, where do you get the numbers from, and what do you base them on?
Yeah, so really what you get the pushback is that, oh yeah, in the past these numbers were generally okay, and the numbers were trustworthy in past conflicts. So we don't have any real reason to question the numbers. Even when you present serious journalists and editors with, well, look, it doesn't make sense, if the things that I said before, and there's other examples as well, well, they say, well, you know, these are the numbers that have been vetted by international organizations, UN and others, so I think they're okay with me. And when you continue to push and ask them, no, you actually need to be doing some investigative journalism and analyze the numbers over a period of months. Look at the statistics, look at the flow, look at the amount, the increase, the decrease, and try to really analyze it. They don't want to. And it's a number that is convenient. I think deep down it fits with the thought patterns and the narrative that many people want to show. That is the story of disproportionate suffering in Gaza and of an easy or a heavy hand on the trigger by Israel. That fits the story, that fits the visuals, that fits the story of Palestinian victimhood, it fits the story of Gazan victimhood, and it blends nicely and supports it from a number perspective. That is why I think deep down that number isn't questioned. And as I said, Israel should do better and have a number of itself, and to analyze the numbers that the Palestinian authorities bring forward.
But I mean, you have been controlling big parts of Gaza. It should have been not very difficult to count the bodies of the dead.
First of all, it is difficult. It is difficult in war to count, to get reliable information, and really to understand where people are, what happened, and why. You know, every day people die not related to war, of so-called natural causes, of disease, etc. I think, and I've seen quite a lot of information that suggests that many people who died in Gaza out of non-war related causes were pushed into the category of war casualties by the Gaza Health Ministry because they have an interest in boosting those numbers. But it's very difficult, I think, to analyze that really on a dedicated level. It takes resources. These are resources that Israel has.
Yeah, but it should be in your interest, since the big information war is about the casualties on the civilian side, and you know that's a soft spot of the Israeli army. So
yeah, that's why I recommended it early on.
Yeah. Sadly,
that recommendation wasn't accepted.
So what is your estimation between civilians and combatants?
So the information that the IDF has released, based on its intel assessment and various sources, looking at Hamas information, looking at its own information, intelligence collected on the battlefield, and many other sources, the IDF has said that we have killed more than 13,000 Hamas operatives and wounded, severely wounded, about the same amount. So 13,000. So let's say that there have been killed in Gaza 30, 31, or they claim now 34,000. Let's lend that legitimacy. I don't think that it's a correct number, but let's say that it's correct. So out of the 34, Israel believes that at least 13,000 of them are active combatants.
So 1-to-3 ratio.
Yeah, between 1-2 and 1-3.
Okay.
These are, as sad as it sounds, still much better statistics and much better ratio than any other conflict in the world in urban terrain since World War II. No other military has achieved that.
There came news recently with accusation of a mass grave in Gaza. What is your comment on that?
Yeah, I suppose you're referring to the one allegedly in Khan Yunis.
Yeah.
So I think that's a typical example of news that travel fast, disseminated by Hamas, leveraged by international media, and as the saying goes, a lie can travel the world twice around before truth gets its pants on. What happened here was that it traveled many times around the world until finally Israel got to the bottom of it. And what actually was exposed, and they did some open source social media investigation, was that there are indeed mass graves, but they weren't dug by Israel, and it wasn't some sinister crime done by Israel, but it was a mass grave that was dug by Gazans in Khan Yunis, close to the Nasser hospital, where they dug graves because there were lots of people killed and they didn't have the capacity to store the bodies or to do the funerals in a normal way. And it was shown on social media 2 months ago by Palestinians who were filming it and said, these are the mass graves that we've dug, and sad story of people being buried, etc. Then came the allegations and the spin that this was an Israeli mass grave, and it was then refuted by Israel. Once it was more or less refuted by Israel, it becomes less of a story, and the story doesn't, media doesn't cover it in, oh, how were we tricked by Hamas into reporting that this was an Israeli mass grave? But when Israel finally gets the information out, then the story kind of disappears. Same thing with the Al Ahli hospital in northern Gaza. Hamas claimed, and that was parroted by most Western media, Israel bombed the hospital and 500 people were killed. Those were the headlines across all of the networks, TVs and TV and websites and everything else. Israel kills 500 in the hospital. And quickly we investigated within a matter of hours, and we presented facts, radio, radar data, visual imagery, etc., that made it very clear that it wasn't an Israeli strike on the hospital, but in fact a rocket that was fired by the Islamic Jihad, misfired, exploded in the air, and then landed on the parking lot of the hospital. Investigations were done by international media. Most of those investigations supported what Israel had said. But it was amazing, of course, to see that the damage had mostly already been done, because media organizations, the BBC, New York Times, AP, and many others were very quick to say, and basically to take the information, the sensational information provided by Hamas, which is a party to a conflict, and to use that as if it was true.
What is your comment on these big news agencies being very quick on who's the culprit in these kind of attacks?
That's, normal in war is that, or in media, is that you have to be quick, you want to be out first, you want to lead with the story, and you want to beat the competition in having the breaking news out. Those are the rules of the game, that's the business. What I think we're seeing in this conflict is a willingness to cut corners in general, to cut corners and to go below journalistic standards when it comes to events where Israel can be blamed, and then upholding tremendously high, rigorous standards of ethics in journalism when it comes to verifying what Israel says. And the amount of times that I heard the sentence, Israel claimed, but it couldn't be independently verified. CNN couldn't independently verify. BBC wasn't allowed to independently verify. And the New York Times have their similar wording of it, is of course a way of the editors and the journalists to say, they say, but I don't believe it. This isn't applied in general when it comes to information provided by Hamas or provided by an everyday Palestinian. Then it is presented as truth, as undeniable facts. Hamas says 500 people were killed in a hospital and Israel bombed the hospital, that was presented as if it was a real fact immediately by most media organizations. A few were careful, but by and large, almost all of them presented this. And then for the first time in a long time that I remember, BBC was forced to explain themselves and to clarify that they had indeed gotten the facts wrong and that their reporting had misled people, that they had used Hamas information and hadn't acted according to their own journalistic standards of verifying sources, taking their time and being careful about what they reported. So in general, I think that there is, I should call it what it really is, it's hypocrisy and double standards. And the bar is this high when the information comes from Israel and when it's challenging for the Palestinian Hamas narrative, and it's this low or perhaps even below the table when it's information disseminated by Palestinians, by Hamas or any of their supporters, and it is there to hurt Israel.
A slogan is repeated here. We hear it at universities in the USA, we hear it from the pro-Palestinian demonstrations, is the words coming back all again, and that's genocide, that Israel is committing genocide, that Palestinians is the big problem for Israel to live as they want, and they want to exterminate them, or at least they are super careless and don't care if the civilians are killed. What is your comment on this word genocide?
Brilliant PR by Hamas and their supporters in the West. Appropriation of a term that has nothing to do with Israeli policies, everything to do with Hamas policies. If anybody is genocidal in this conflict, it is Hamas, who are on the record in Arabic saying that they will do October 7 again and again and again until they get to Tel Aviv and to Jerusalem, until they defeat Israel, and until they kill the Jews. Those are Hamas statements. And that is, if you want a verbal really translation of what genocide is, that is genocidal. Israel has no such policy. If Israel had any such policy, it would be the worst one in the world, because the Palestinian population has grown by about 450% since 1948. So if Israel is trying to do a genocide, but the population keeps on going, it must be the worst planned and executed genocide in history, unlike actual genocides of other ethnic groups in history, and sadly there are examples.
Maybe they mean that you are indifferent to the killings of the civilians.
I don't think so. I think that is very, very false to say. If we were indifferent, I think Israel would be using totally different tactics. We would be using our military force totally differently. We wouldn't be warning the civilian population ahead of time that we are going to attack a certain area, and we wouldn't be calling on them to leave if we didn't care about them. We wouldn't do roof knocking, where we fire a small bomb on a house before we take it down on a military target, allowing people to leave, those that are not combatants. We wouldn't be providing humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip, and we wouldn't be, in general, applying the distinctions of proportionality the distinction of proportionality, the principle of distinction and proportionality in our fighting. Israel does all this, and when people who really understand military affairs and can compare Israeli fighting to U.S. troops in Iraq, to coalition forces in Afghanistan, to French forces in the Sahel and in fighting in Africa, when you do a hardcore professional comparison of Israeli tactics and the use of force, and you compare it to other Western militaries fighting in urban terrain, what you actually find, and this is a huge inconvenience for Israel haters, is that Israel is much more careful. The process in Israel of targeting is much stricter than in most other militaries, and there are less civilian casualties in Gaza relative to the Battle of Mosul and the fighting against ISIS in Iraq and in Syria in general. This isn't a convenient statistic for most people who are hostile towards Israel, so it's not said a lot. But a lot of military professionals, they analyze the conflict, they see how the IDF operates, and they said, well, our standards aren't this high, and what the Israelis are doing is problematic, not from the bad side, but from a good side, because we won't be able to do the same thing. So I think it's another example of automatic support for Palestinians, and where people use words that they don't understand and they use them totally falsely, and to claim that Israel has a policy or intention or acts in order to perform genocide, it's ridiculous. The only organization that is genocidal in the Middle East along or around Israel is Hamas, who openly say that they want to kill all the Jews with no distinction. That is genocidal. The only problem for them is that they don't have the capacity to do so. But in terms of intentions, that is what their interpretation of jihad and mukawama, resistance, is. Kill the Jews.
When it comes to the military conflict, Israel is superior to Hamas. But when it comes to the information war or the propaganda war, it's hard for you to win the hearts and minds of a lot of people in the West, especially the young people.
Yeah.
So how are you countering this sentiment that is growing of anti-Israeli, even anti-Semitic feelings growing now in the West? What is your tactics? Because you have to pair your military actions with also the information war.
Yeah.
So especially on the social media.
Social media, campuses around the world, in the US, but also in Europe, and the age group of young and people that are easy to impress and influence using social media, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp groups, etc. Less Facebook because most young people are on Facebook, but Instagram and TikTok, those are the two biggest platforms which are used very effectively by our enemies and their supporters around the world in order to undermine the legitimacy of Israel. The real challenge here is, I think, more of a numbers game and algorithm than it is of storytelling. Yes, usually the other side has a good way of telling a story, a simple narrative, catchphrases, chants, and marches that have some kind of romantic pull and strong gravitational force for young people who want to feel that they are fighting for the underdog and that they are supporting the oppressed. And it fits very nicely into these big narratives of shaming white people, shaming Christians, going against institutions, fighting for the underdogs, fighting for the oppressed, fighting for the disenfranchised, who, whatever. And the whole Israel issue fits nicely into all of these, and it falls into all of the wrong categories. And people that are easily influenced, mostly young people with very limited education about what's going on and the history of the conflict, they're really quite exposed, and it's quite easy, and I've seen it, when a certain person's feed on TikTok or Instagram is full of anti-Israeli visuals and stories, sad human stories with graphic visuals of suffering, body parts and destruction, etc. It's very easy to get someone to believe that the Palestinians are right and the Israelis are wrong and cruel, and that everything that is happening in the Middle East is Israel's blame. The challenge here is that it's very difficult numbers-wise to even compare with, and not alone get ahead of the curve when it comes to the algorithm, because the amount of users that are inherently on the other side of the narrative, not necessarily Israel enemies, but that generally would more naturally gravitate towards a Palestinian perspective, they outnumber Israel by a factor of hundreds.
But if you,
that's part of the challenge, numbers-wise. Where I think Israel should be doing much more, could be doing much more, and has to be doing much more, is to engage more on social media and have a totally different perspective on how Israel does its public affairs, its public relations, and to put that front and center of our national strategy. As you say correctly, there's the fighting in reality on the ground, and then there is virtual reality. Sometimes virtual reality is more important than actual reality. Sometimes virtual reality spins around reality slaps it on the back of the head and really shapes reality out of nothing. And we see that time and time again. And until Israel understands that it has to be as strong in its PR capabilities as it is in real-world capabilities, and Israel is very strong in defending itself across all platforms, different dimensions of operations, different fronts. Israel has amazing capabilities here, very talented people, well-resourced. What Israel needs to do is to develop the same or similar set of capabilities to defend itself virtually. And until Israel does that, I think we will continue to have these conversations, and people will continue to ask people like me and many others, you're doing such a horrible job at explaining what Israel is and the challenges, etc., and everybody hates you. And I think that Israel has to be better at that. But that's a deep, broad, structural, strategic change that has to happen in Israel. It has to be top-down, budgets, directives, priorities. It has to be reflected in personnel, recruitment, priority, and it has to be a totally different way of operating than what Israel is doing now. Israel is still, in my mind, addressing it in an amateurish way, not in a serious, systemic way. If we addressed our PA challenges the same way that we address our challenges against Iran or against Hezbollah, with building weapon systems, with building capabilities, with budgeting and prioritizing it, I think we would be in a different situation. We won't be loved by most people around the world anyhow. And I think that anti-Semitism is a very strong factor that is always behind the scenes, and it's always relevant, and it always shapes and fuels a lot of the hatred towards Israel. We won't be able to overcome that, but I think that we can do more in order to defend ourselves and in order to have more legitimacy and eventually more freedom of movement. That's what it's about, to enable yourself to act and to defend yourself and to use real capabilities in such a way that suits your strategy. And what we're talking about here isn't conquering the deserts of Iraq. It's just defending the homeland, just defending Israelis living in their homes. That's what it's about. It's about Israelis living in their homes safely without being butchered by stormtroopers coming in from Gaza.
But I think, are you approaching this too much in an engineering way? Like an engineer, you're building weapons, you are doing strategies, but you are not seeing the emotions. Like the 7th of October, the general opinion swayed in your way. Temporarily. And then the 14th of April, when Iran attacking you with all these 300 missiles and ballistic drones and so on, for a few days you had also empathy. So people are affected by reason and by feelings.
Mostly by emotions.
Mostly by emotions. But
I'm saying is, I totally agree, and we totally agree with, of course, that people make decisions based on their emotions. And when I spoke about people being influenced by social media, that is tapping into the emotions, right? When you see horrible images, and when it says that this was done by Israel, then the emotion that is being created is one of anger and disgust and the urge to act. What I'm saying is that in order to generate these emotions, then Israel has to take the issue seriously and build the capabilities, build the tools that will be able to generate emotions, just like our enemies and adversaries and the other side is doing. They take it seriously. They understand that this is a tool. This is the way to fight against Israel. Right? Our enemies, they've been fighting us for decades. First, they fought us with rocks and stones, then with weapons, then with tanks and armies, and with rockets and missiles, then with suicide bombers, and now it's mostly about what you generally can call BDS, lawfare, and media warfare. When everything else failed, when they couldn't, beat Israel on the battlefield, then our Arab armies, they found out after 3 or 4 wars that they would very much like to defeat Israel and kill all the Jews and annihilate Israel, but they couldn't. They tried in 48, they tried in 67, they tried in 73, didn't succeed. And then they said, okay, well then let's change the strategy. Let's fire missiles from afar. That has worked to a certain extent, but that hasn't annihilated Israel either, and the stubborn Jews are still in their homeland. When that doesn't work, then okay, let's take the battle to a different realm, and that is global diplomacy and public affairs. And let's attack the very legitimacy of Israel to exist and to fight, and let's try to shame Israel out of existence. It's the same continuum of fighting against Israel. It has just metaphor or shaped into a different type of combat. But I draw a direct line between BDS campaigners and people who scream from the river to the sea today to the Ba'ath party in Syria and the Syrian army trying to invade Israel and annihilate Israel in 67 and 73. Same thing, just different evolutions of it, the same objective, to defeat Israel, to annihilate Israel, but having failed many times on the way, and Israel successfully defending itself. I draw there's some hope for the future here, because Israel has shown over the years that it has been able to successfully develop and evolve according to the challenges that we've met. Right? We first dealt with militaries, and then with incoming missiles, and with terrorism, and now we're in the realm of media, etc. Media was always there, but I think it is bigger now. It's a much more potent threat, and Israel just has to adapt. That's why I speak about a structural, conceptual understanding in Israel, where we have to understand and act accordingly, that this is the battlefield, that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs should have 5 times of the budget that it has today, and should we be equipped by kick-ass people that are assertive and are on a mission to fight for Israel, and that the budget and spending and the capabilities of Israel to engage in media warfare and to fight in the PR should be totally different. This should be a national priority, and it isn't so far.
Wars are very costly. So I want to talk a bit about the economics of war. And the resilience of Israel, capability to have this ongoing war. When the Hamas launches a Qassam rocket, cost about $1,000 or less, and you intercept it with a Iron Dome missile, which cost about $100,000. That's 1% cost that the Palestinians have compared to Israelis. Mm-hmm. How long can this go on? And especially if also Hezbollah comes into launching, they have, 150,000 missiles.
Yeah, a little bit less now, but yeah.
Yeah. So how long can Israel be able to sustain this kind of warfare, which is also economic warfare?
So it's less a question of the price of armaments. That is part of the issue, but I think it's that isn't telling the story. It's more about macroeconomics, about the workforce, about where the most productive parts of Israeli society are, and whether they are in reserves fighting or if they're home and working. Israel is, as I said before, a small country with very limited resources. Yes, we cast a long shadow, and many think that Israel is far stronger than it really is, and it is a strong country. But in all, it's a small country of less than 10 million people with tremendous challenges, with a lot of disparity or differences in workforce capabilities and the ability to generate and to sustain a very high GDP, which is already mid or high level OECD comparison. Israel, it has done tremendously well, and from an economic point of view, that's not my field of expertise, but really from an economic point of view, Israel is a miracle for such a young country in such a harsh environment with such tremendous security limitations and stress applied on the system continuously, like no other country. Despite all that, Israel has climbed its way into mid-tier, in some areas top-tier OECD statistics in terms of infrastructure, investment, high-tech, R&D, universities, of course, high-tech, medical tech, etc. The challenge here is, how long can Israel continue to fight and to be in a state of war whether it's high intensity, mid intensity, or low intensity, but in a state of war, that has a negative effect on the macro parts of Israeli society, of Israeli economy, on the market, on investment, and on its ability to export, and its R&D, and all of the things that really pull the Israeli economy that are totally different from the entire region. When you look at the Israeli economy and you compare it to anything happening in a 2,000-kilometer radius, it's really a bright beacon of light and excellence, and our enemies are all in failed communities and failed states where the GDP is less than a 20th of our GDP, and who have a totally different value system. They value mukawama, jihad, death, and martyrdom, where we value life and prosperity, quality of life, and progress. The challenge here is that when these two systems collide, then they have less to lose than what we have. Our standards of living are much higher, and we have become accustomed to our standards of living. And for them, it's not a big deal. It's not such a big deal if the standards go a little bit lower, but for Israel, it is a big deal if the standards go lower. And to be clear about it, Israel does not have an interest in a prolonged war. It is not good for our economy. It is not good for the market. There are certain parts of the economy that benefit, that will do well, that are doing well. Most things related to defense, defense exports, defense R&D, which are a sizable part of the Israeli economy, but not the most important part. And they, of course, will be doing well, but the other parts of the Israeli market will not. The Israeli National Bank has issued initial statements about it, and the figures are not very good. They could be much worse, but the Israeli economy is still strong. But the assessment that the Bank of Israel gave is one of the longer it goes on, the worse it will be for the economy, in short. And I think that's clear. Where it becomes challenging is that when you look at the threats around Israel, and when you look at the multitude of Iranian terror organizations, Iranian proxies that have been allowed and able to establish themselves along our borders, the military capabilities that they have, and what Israel needs to do in order to defend Israeli civilians from those military capabilities, the military reality on the ground dictates a long period of fighting in order to safeguard Israeli civilians. The economic and perhaps diplomatic and political reality doesn't compute. And the logic of the economic side would be to do a short, fierce, and limited war, and not to extract the period of fighting in the longer period. So there's a tension between military reality and economic reality. And I think that most Israelis are understanding that there will be tougher years ahead. Israel has enjoyed so far tremendous growth, and the Israeli economy is still very strong. Israelis are resilient, they are resourceful, they are capable of great ingenuity, tech, R&D. Israeli universities are amongst the best in the world in many or very good in the world in many rankings. And I, as an Israeli, have great faith in the Israeli market. But the challenges are very significant.
Well, let's just finish with looking at the different theaters here. We have the Gaza, we have Lebanon, we have Iran, of course. First of all, Gaza. What's happening in Gaza? How many troops do you still have in Gaza? How much do you control of Gaza? And you have cordoned now Hamas into Rafah area.
Yeah.
What will happen next?
So there's a lot of troops fighting in many different locations. We're fighting in Gaza, which is still the main theater of operations. We're defending along the Lebanese border against Hezbollah. We are deployed on the Syrian border against Syrian forces, Hezbollah and Iranian proxies fighting in Syria, from Syria against Israel. We are defending along the border with Jordan, a small amount of troops. And we are busy with counter-terrorism operations in Judea and Samaria, what some people still refer to as the West Bank, but in Judea and Samaria, PA areas. We are fighting there every day and every night against Palestinian terror organizations that are trying to either kill Israeli soldiers or Israeli civilians and attack Israeli communities. And that's happening every day and every night. So there's a very big, and of course, further away on the strategic level, Israel is defending itself against incoming missiles, drones, and rockets from the Houthis, another Iranian proxy in Yemen that have been firing those towards Israel. Even though they're 2,000 kilometers away, they've been firing rockets and missiles at Israel, none of them very successful, but Israel has been defending itself. And Israel is, of course, also in a state of war with, or let's say, hostilities with Iran, which is a very big event. Iran attacked Israeli soil, Israel retaliated and struck Iranian soil, and we're in a totally new situation there with Iran. So there's a lot of military activities.
Yeah, many fronts. But if we look at Gaza,
so the situation in Gaza is that currently, 2 days ago, Israel made a local and limited move so far and went in and took hold of the Rafah border crossing. Israel hasn't taken the city of Rafah. It hasn't started to expose all of the tunnel networks that exist underneath Rafah. And the campaign to clear civilians out of Rafah in order to make it safer for them to exit so that they are not affected or killed by war. That campaign has started, and Israel has called on civilians there to move out to other humanitarian zones in the Gaza Strip. In many other parts of the Gaza Strip, there's very little fighting currently. And
so you have complete control, more or less, of the whole Gaza?
I wouldn't say that, no. Okay. I would say that there's been one wave of Israeli operations that has taken out a lot of Hamas's capabilities, but a lot of capabilities still exist in terms of Hamas.
How many combatants do you estimate that still are with the Hamas?
In terms of formations, units that are capable of collecting intelligence, managing operations, logistics, etc., we're looking at 5 out of 24 battalions that probably still have combat capabilities. They have been degraded somewhat, but 5 out of 24 battalions are more or less intact with capabilities, and all of them are located in or around Rafah. That is why it's also very important for Israel to go in.
So we are talking about what we're talking about, 5,000 to 10,000 combatants, or
ish, roughly. But that isn't the only way of measuring it, because we're dealing with a terrorist organization that is built in order to continue to fight even without proper military structures, using the civilian infrastructure, hiding amongst the civilians, and then continuing the fight at the lower level of intensity when the opportunity arises. This means that it will take time. When Israel will go into Rafah, will fight against those battalions there, will defeat them. There will be casualties on the Israeli side. There will be lots of casualties on the Hamas side. But eventually, those battalions will be defeated, just like the Hamas battalions in Gaza City and in Khan Yunis and in Nuseirat and all of the other places were eventually defeated when the IDF got there. That will be the case in Rafah as well. But what really the challenge is, looking forward, how long will it take the IDF and Israel to really dismantle all of Hamas's military capabilities and to achieve a basic level of control over the situation so that the rebuilding of the Gaza Strip can begin, and to really shape the future in a way that makes sure that there is no terrorist capabilities in Gaza that will be capable of
So we're talking about a many-year campaign then?
We're talking about many, many months and probably years.
Okay. And lastly, what is after you have taken control of Gaza as your objective, what will you do with...
The objective isn't control of Gaza. The objective is to dismantle Hamas, its military and administrative capabilities. And I think that Israel doesn't have an objective to take control of Gaza.
Who will be in control of Gaza?
Excellent question, to which there isn't a good answer yet.
Okay, so we leave that question.
Yeah.
You have the other bigger threats at the border towards Lebanon, the Hezbollah. What will you do? Will you go in with ground troops, or what will you do with when it comes to Hezbollah? How will you deal with them?
Hezbollah is a much more significant military threat than Hamas is. They have very significant firepower. They have more firepower than quite a lot of European countries has today, which from a historical perspective is kind of interesting, that a Levantine militia is stronger than many European sovereign countries. I think that what Israel will eventually need to do, and of course we don't have time to go into all of the details here, but Israel cannot live, and Israelis cannot live in a reality where Hezbollah is deployed just on the other side of the border in Lebanon, violating UN Security Council Resolution 1701 every day. And Israelis cannot tolerate that. So in some way, Hezbollah will have to be moved away from the border. If it will be created by some kind of diplomatic deal, great. It'll save a lot of lives in Lebanon and in Israel, save a lot of destruction, and it's probably the preferred way. If that doesn't happen, and there's no diplomatic deal, then Israel will have to make it happen in other ways, which will be to use force. How will Hezbollah be motivated to move away from the border and not to threaten Israeli civilians? Probably by killing them.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan, that you came here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for looking at Hotspot. And you are Swedish speaking. You are welcome back next week with new programs. Thank you very much.